The story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the houses all looked like they were copied and pasted out of a brochure. The lawns were trimmed to perfection, the hedges were squared at exact angles, and not a single mailbox stood taller than another. But among all of this carefully maintained conformity stood one property that drew the eye in a different way: my home. My garden wasn't just a patch of flowers. It was a carefully cultivated collection of native plants, wildflowers, herbs, and pollinator-friendly shrubs. Instead of the plain green sod that soaked up gallons of wasted water like the rest of the community, my front yard was alive with colors, textures, and buzzing life. Butterflies hovered over coneflowers. Bees dived into lavender stalks. Bright orange lilies bent toward the morning sun. Neighbors would stop and admire it, sometimes even asking for tips. Kids pointed out the monarch butterflies, watching them flutter from one bloom to the next. For me, it wasn't just landscaping. It was a personal sanctuary, something that kept me grounded after long work weeks. But there was one person who hated it with every fiber of her being: Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA. Karen didn't just live in the neighborhood, she ruled it. At least that's how she saw herself. Every holiday light, every trash bin left out for more than a day, every garage door left open for more than 10 minutes. Karen noticed. And if she noticed, the HOA board noticed, because she made sure to file a complaint. To her, my garden wasn't beautiful. It was non-compliant landscaping. It wasn't uniform. It wasn't within the narrow rules of what she believed a front yard should look like. And worst of all, it made her property, with its perfect green rectangle of grass, look dull and lifeless by comparison. At first, the complaints started small. A letter in the mailbox about unauthorized plants. A warning email about yard non-conformance. I knew the HOA bylaws. I had read them front to back before planting a single flower, and nothing in those documents prohibited what I had done. In fact, my use of native plants was actively supported by the state's environmental programs, which encouraged water-efficient and pollinator-friendly landscaping. But Karen didn't care about laws or state incentives. She cared about control. I ignored her letters at first, filing them away as the petty tantrums of someone desperate for power. But Karen wasn't the type to be ignored. Her visits started next, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, glaring at my garden like it was a personal insult. Sometimes she muttered into her phone, snapping pictures as if each bloom was evidence of a crime. When I planned a trip out of town for work, a week-long conference across the state, I had no idea how Karen was preparing her biggest move yet. I left my garden in full bloom, expecting to return to the same vibrant display. But when I pulled into my driveway days later, suitcase still in the trunk, my heart dropped. The garden was gone. Every flower, every shrub, every carefully planted corner of life had been ripped out. The soil was bare, uneven, and freshly disturbed. It looked as if someone had bulldozed years of effort in a single afternoon. I stood frozen, staring at the destruction. My hands shook with rage, but also with disbelief. Who could have done this? The answer came in the form of a folded notice taped to my front door. HOA compliance notice, the header read in bold. And underneath, a signature I recognized instantly. Karen, she had done it. While I was away, she had authorized the removal of my garden, citing violation of HOA landscaping standards. The letter smugly noted that future violations will result in fines. At that moment, the fury inside me hardened into something sharper. I wasn't just angry. I was ready for war. Because what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't even imagine, was that the very state she lived in had passed strict protections for native landscaping, and what she had just ordered, what she had smugly carried out in the name of compliance, wasn't just overreach, it was illegal. And the penalty wasn't a simple fine for me, it was a fine for her. As I stood in the driveway, staring at the barren dirt where my garden once thrived, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Karen had just torched her own future with a single reckless decision. The seeds of revenge had already been planted. And unlike the flowers she ripped away, these were about to bloom bigger than she ever expected. The morning after I discovered the destruction of my garden, I stood in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. My eyes were fixed on the bare soil outside my window, a void where beauty used to live. Every petal, every stem, every butterfly that had once graced that patch of earth was gone, stolen under the false flag of compliance. The rage from the night before had hardened into determination. Karen thought she had won, but what she didn't understand was that the law was clear. And this time, the law wasn't on her side. A year earlier, my state had passed legislation protecting native and drought-resistant landscaping. The measure wasn't just a suggestion, it was binding law. Homeowners' associations were explicitly forbidden from banning, removing, or interfering with native gardens. The state's environmental agency even published pamphlets spelling it out. Water-saving and pollinator-friendly landscaping was protected. Karen hadn't just overstepped HOA rules. She had broken state law. I spent that morning gathering everything I needed, photos of my garden before I left, time-stamped and stored on my phone, pictures of the destruction when I came back, the smug compliance notice she taped to my door, complete with her signature, and, most importantly, a copy of the state statute that laid out my rights in black and white. Every piece of evidence fit together perfectly, like a trap snapping shut. The next step was filing a formal complaint with the State Department of Environmental Quality. Their website had an entire section dedicated to homeowner rights under the landscaping law. A few clicks later, I was filling out the form, attaching my photos, uploading Karen's letter, and typing out a detailed explanation of what happened. By the time I hit submit, I felt the weight of momentum shifting. Karen thought she could intimidate me with HOA authority, but she had just invited a state agency into her business, and unlike me, she couldn't ignore their letters. Over. The next week, I waited. The HOA remained silent, though I noticed Karen's car driving by my house more often than usual. She slowed down each time, glaring at the barren yard as if daring me to replant it. Little did she know, I wasn't planting flowers yet. I was waiting for something much bigger. Then the envelope arrived. Thick, official, stamped with the seal of the Department of Environmental Quality. I opened it at my kitchen counter, unfolding the letter carefully. The words were everything I hoped for. The state had reviewed my complaint. They found that the HOA's actions violated Section 12 of the Native Landscaping Protection Act. The removal of my garden was unlawful, and because the removal had been authorized and carried out by the HOA board, specifically signed off by its acting compliance officer, liability fell squarely on them. The penalty? A fine of $5,000. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen, who had tormented me with letters about future fines, had just secured one for herself, a fine that came directly from the state, with no appeal and no wiggle room. But the best part wasn't even the money. The letter required that the HOA restore my garden to its prior condition at their expense. Karen's mission to erase my sanctuary had backfired in the most poetic way possible. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. 2 days later, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Flyers were stuffed into mailboxes, announcing the gathering at the community clubhouse. Curious, I went. I wanted to see the look on Karen's face when she tried to explain herself. The clubhouse was packed. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, some standing along the walls. At the front, the board members shuffled papers nervously, but all eyes were on Karen. She stood at the center table, a thick stack of documents in front of her, lips pressed into a thin line. The meeting opened with tense murmurs. Then the board president cleared his throat and read aloud from the state's letter. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he detailed the fine, the violation, and the requirement to restore my garden. Karen's face flushed red, her composure cracked, as whispers filled the room. "She really ripped up his whole garden?" one neighbor muttered. $5,000? For flowers? Another scoffed. Karen tried to interject, raising her voice over the noise. This was necessary for compliance. His yard was in violation, but the president cut her off. "The state doesn't agree. They've fined us because of your decision. You acted outside of your authority." The words landed like stones, in water, heavy and unavoidable. Karen had always thrived on the board's willingness to let her run wild with enforcement, but now they were distancing themselves. The fine wasn't coming from her personal account, it was hitting the HOA's budget. That meant every neighbor in the room was paying for her power trip. The murmurs turned to open anger. "This is coming out of our dues?" someone shouted. "You went after him, and now we're all punished," another added. Karen's jaw tightened. She tried to push blame onto me, claiming I provoked the issue with my unconventional garden. But nobody was buying it. The state's letter left no room for interpretation. She had broken the law, not me. I sat quietly in the back, arms crossed, letting the scene play out. For once, I didn't have to defend myself. Karen was doing all the damage to her own reputation. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to cover the restoration of my garden using HOA funds. But not before making an announcement that sent a shockwave through the room. Karen was suspended from her role as compliance officer, pending further review. Her mouth dropped open, and for the first time since I'd lived in the neighborhood, she looked powerless. I walked home that evening under the glow of porch lights, a small smile tugging at my lips. My garden would bloom again, and Karen's iron grip on the community had just cracked. But little did I know. This was only the beginning. Because Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, and the war she was about to wage would make everything so far look like a warm-up. For a few weeks, the neighborhood was strangely quiet. My garden remained bare, though the board had hired a landscaping company to begin restoration. Trucks came and went, workers unrolled fresh soil, and I caught glimpses of new plants being delivered. The HOA was following the state's orders to the letter, and it should have been a time of peace. But if there's one thing I had learned, it was that Karen never accepted defeat. At first, her retaliation came in whispers. I overheard conversations. At the mailbox, murmurs among neighbors that maybe he exaggerated the complaint, or that it wasn't fair the HOA had to pay. It didn't take long to realize where the rumors were coming from. Karen was spinning her own version of events, painting herself as a victim of overreach and me as a vindictive troublemaker who dragged the state into our neighborhood. The more I ignored her, the louder she became. Flyers started appearing on doorsteps, unofficial, printed on cheap paper, signed only with "concerned neighbors." They accused me of costing the community thousands of dollars, of being selfish and disruptive. One flyer even claimed my garden attracted dangerous wildlife and was a hazard to property values. Of course, everyone knew who was behind them. Karen's style was unmistakable. Dramatic wording, bolded accusations, and just enough misinformation to stir resentment. At first, I brushed it off. Let her rant. The truth was documented in state law and agency letters, but the real problem wasn't her flyers. It was how easily people believed them. Some neighbors stopped waving at me when I drove by. Others began avoiding me altogether. Karen's campaign was working, at least on those who didn't care to. Check the facts. But she wasn't done. One Friday morning, I woke to find a bright orange notice taped to my garage door. "Property standards violation," it read in block letters. The complaint? Unsightly yard. I laughed at the absurdity. The yard was still under restoration, a process the HOA itself was paying for under state mandate. How could they cite Me for a mess they were responsible for fixing? Still, I attended the next board meeting to address it. When I arrived, I immediately noticed Karen sitting in the front row, not at the board's table, but directly facing the members, arms folded, like a general commanding troops. She no longer had her compliance officer badge, but her presence was heavy enough to dominate the room. As the meeting began, she raised her hand and, without waiting for acknowledgement, launched into a tirade. "This neighborhood is falling apart because we allow special treatment," she declared. "We cannot let one homeowner drag us all down. His yard is unsightly. His actions are costing us thousands, and he continues to mock our rules. If the board won't enforce standards, then maybe it's time we elect people who will." Her words hung in the air like poison. A few neighbors clapped. Others shifted uncomfortably. I stood calmly when it was my turn. "The restoration is being done under state order," I explained evenly. "This board has no authority to override it. Karen knows this. She's choosing to ignore the law because it doesn't suit her." The board members nodded uneasily, caught between their duty and the pressure Karen exerted. The president spoke up, reminding the room that the fine had been real, the violation had been real, and the restoration was required. The orange notice, he confirmed, was invalid. Karen's face tightened, but she didn't back down. Instead, she shifted tactics. "Maybe the state protects your weeds," she sneered, "but the state doesn't decide who runs this HOA. We do, and if this board won't act, I'll make sure the next one does." That was the moment I realized her true plan. She wasn't just trying to harass me with flyers and fake violations. She was organizing a full takeover of the HOA itself, and that I knew was dangerous, because if Karen regained power, this time as board president instead of just compliance officer, she wouldn't stop at my garden. She would use every ounce of authority to control the entire neighborhood, bending the rules to her will and crushing anyone who opposed her. The weeks that followed confirmed my fears. Karen went door to door, canvassing like a politician. She promised lower dues, stricter enforcement of aesthetic standards, and a return to the way things used to be. She painted me as the villain, the outsider who brought government interference into a private community, and people listened. Her campaign gained traction. By the time election season rolled around, it was clear she had support, more than I expected. Yard signs popped up with slogans like "Take Back Our Neighborhood," and though they weren't signed, everyone knew whose campaign they belonged to. I wasn't running for the board, but I suddenly found myself at the center of an election battle. Neighbors knocked on my door, asking me to explain my side. Others left notes of encouragement, telling me they were tired of Karen's theatrics. The neighborhood was divided, lines drawn between those who wanted order at any cost and those who valued freedom from her iron grip. The night of the election meeting, the clubhouse buzzed with energy. Rows of chairs filled quickly, the air thick with anticipation. At the front, ballots were stacked, ready to decide the future of the community. Karen stood tall, wearing a blazer as if she were already president. Her smile was tight, confident, rehearsed. She believed this was her moment, her redemption. As the voting began, I sat quietly in the back. I wasn't a candidate, but I knew I had a role to play. If Karen won, my garden battle would be only the first of many wars. If she lost, her influence would be shattered once and for all. When the ballots were finally counted, the room held its breath. The board president cleared his throat, unfolded the paper, and announced the results. And that's when the real shock hit the room. The moment the board president read the results, the room froze. Karen had lost, not by a landslide, not by the crushing victory she had promised her supporters, but by a narrow margin that stung even more. 2 seats on the board had flipped, but not in her favor. Instead, her loudest allies had been voted out, replaced by quieter, steadier neighbors who had grown tired of the constant drama. For a long, heavy second, nobody moved. Then murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some clapped in relief, others shook their heads in disbelief, but all eyes turned toward Karen. Her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before she forced it back onto her face. She stood, smoothing, her blazer like nothing had happened. "Congratulations," she said stiffly, her voice carrying just enough edge to betray the storm beneath. "I suppose the neighborhood has spoken." But even as she said it, her glare swept across the room, searching for the person she could blame. Her eyes landed on me. I knew that look. This wasn't over. In the days following the election, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who had been silent during Karen's campaign finally spoke up. Some stopped by to say they were glad the smear flyers hadn't worked. Others admitted they were scared to vote against her openly, fearing retaliation. The new board promised transparency, accountability, and an end to the chaos that had plagued the community for years. But if Karen's election loss had weakened her power officially, it had only made her more dangerous unofficially. Rumors began to circulate, this time not about me, but about the board itself. Karen accused them of rigging the election, of mishandling ballots, of being puppets for outsiders. She couldn't accept that she had simply lost. She had to convince her followers that the system had betrayed them, and some people believed her. It started small. Whispers of a recall petition, quiet gatherings in living rooms. But soon, her influence spilled back into public view. A group of her loyalists began challenging every decision the board made. If the landscaping company needed funds approved, they called it wasteful. If the pool hours were adjusted, they called it an attack on families. Every minor issue became a battlefield. It was exhausting to watch. Meanwhile, my garden restoration was finally nearing completion. Fresh soil had been laid, young plants carefully chosen and placed according to state guidelines. Slowly, life returned to the space Karen had stripped bare. Neighbors walking past began to smile again, some pausing to comment on how beautiful it looked. The irony was clear. The very thing Karen had tried to destroy had become a symbol of resilience in the community. That only made her more furious. One evening, just as the sun dipped low, I stepped outside to water the new plants. That's when I noticed Karen parked at the end of the street, her car idling, headlights pointed directly at my yard. She didn't step out, didn't speak, just sat there watching. After several minutes, she drove off. It wasn't illegal, but it was unsettling. I began documenting everything. Every odd flyer that showed up, every orange notice taped to my garage, every late-night car parked outside my house. I had learned my lesson. With Karen, evidence was everything, and soon I'd need it, because Karen wasn't done plotting. At the next board meeting, she arrived with a thick binder in hand. Not an official role, not as a candidate, but as a concerned homeowner. She stood before the board, holding her binder high, and announced that she had compiled a dossier on me. Her accusations were wild, claims that I was running an unlicensed business from my home, that I had falsified state complaints, that my garden restoration was actually a cover for some shady scheme. Every word was baseless, but she presented it with such conviction that a few gasps rose from the audience. The board, to their credit, asked her calmly for evidence. Karen flipped through her binder, slamming down papers with highlighted sections, arrows, and sticky notes. But when reviewed closely, it all unraveled. Articles printed from random websites, screenshots from Facebook posts with no context, photos of my garden taken from odd angles to make it look messy. It wasn't proof, it was obsession, one of... The new board members leaned forward, voice steady but firm. "Karen, this isn't an investigation. This is harassment. We're done entertaining personal vendettas." For the first time in public, someone said it plainly, and the room erupted. Half. The neighbors cheered, relieved to see the board finally push back. The other half, Karen's loyalists, booed and shouted about bias. Karen herself turned red, her composure cracking. She slammed the binder shut, snapped that the board was corrupt, and stormed out of the meeting. But as dramatic as her exit was, I knew it wasn't the end. That night I found another flyer on my doorstep. This one was different. Not an attack on me specifically, but a call to action. "Take back our rights," it read in bold letters. It urged neighbors to join Karen in fighting the illegitimate board, to prepare for a recall election, to stand against government interference. Karen wasn't just lashing out anymore. She was building a movement, and movements, I knew, were harder to stop than one angry woman. The neighborhood was now split cleanly down the middle. On one side, families who wanted peace, who were tired of drama and fines. On the other, those who believed Karen's narrative of corruption and control. Tension simmered at every corner, small disputes escalating into shouting matches. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon when two neighbors nearly came to blows over Karen's flyers. Voices rose, hands waved, and before long, the police had to be called to break it up. The board realized then what I had known for weeks. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was a threat to the community's stability, and they would have to make a choice: let her continue unchecked or take stronger action against her. The question was, did they have the courage to do it? By the time spring arrived, the tension in the neighborhood had become impossible to ignore. What had once been a quiet community with neatly trimmed lawns and friendly nods across driveways had turned into a battlefield divided by loyalty, fear, and frustration. And at the center of it all stood Karen. Her recall campaign had gained momentum. Flyers, door-to-door visits, even a hastily made website with bold claims about the board's corruption circulated daily. Her followers parroted her words at meetings, questioning every expense, every policy, every small decision. The neighborhood was caught in a cycle of endless disputes, each one louder than the last. But underneath the chaos, Karen was slipping. For every neighbor who believed her story, there were two who had grown weary of the drama. Complaints began to pour into the board, not about me or the new garden, but about Karen herself. Harassment, trespassing, aggressive late-night confrontations. Parents said she followed their children home from the park. Others reported her, knocking on doors at midnight, demanding they sign her recall petition. The board couldn't ignore it anymore. At the next meeting, the new president, calm, soft-spoken but firm, stood up and addressed the elephant in the room. "We have received multiple complaints about harassment, intimidation, and disruption to our community. We are investigating all claims, but let me be clear. If this behavior continues, we will have no choice but to pursue legal remedies." It was the first time the word legal had been spoken aloud. The room went silent. Karen, sitting in the back row with her arms crossed, let out a sharp laugh. Legal remedies? For what? For daring to hold this corrupt board accountable? Please, you're bluffing. But the board wasn't bluffing. Behind the scenes, they had already been in touch with the State Housing Authority, the same office that had fined Karen for destroying my garden. And the advice was clear. If Karen's harassment didn't stop, the HOA had the right to issue a formal cease and desist, followed by civil action if necessary. The news spread quickly. Some neighbors breathed a sigh of relief, hoping it meant the end of Karen's reign of chaos. Others doubled down, convinced the board was trying to silence her. The split grew sharper. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything. Karen's late-night car stakeouts, the flyers taped to my mailbox, the phone calls with no one on the other end. Every shred of evidence I saved, because deep down, I knew Karen wasn't going to back down, not without a fight. That fight came sooner than expected. One morning, I stepped outside to find my garden vandalized again. Not destroyed this time, but damaged. Plants uprooted, soil scattered across the driveway, a section of the irrigation system ripped out. And right in the center of the mess, was a flyer, weighed down with a brick. "Stop siding with corruption," it read. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. I reported it immediately. The board added it to the growing file of complaints, and that was the breaking point. The very next week, Karen received an official letter, signed by the board's attorney, ordering her to cease all harassment, vandalism, and intimidation within the community. Failure to comply would result in legal action. It was a line drawn in bold ink. Karen's response? She escalated. She began holding rallies, not in some distant park, but right on her lawn. Dozens of neighbors gathered, waving signs, chanting slogans about freedom from HOA tyranny. Cars lined the street, blocking driveways. Children couldn't ride their bikes without weaving through angry adults, shouting into megaphones. Karen thrived in the chaos, standing on her porch like a general commanding troops. Every word she shouted was another accusation. Lies twisted into sharp weapons aimed at anyone who opposed her, and her favorite target was still me. "She's the reason for all this," she cried during one rally, pointing down the street toward my house. The fines, the lawsuits, the corruption, it all started with her. I watched from behind closed blinds, my stomach sinking. She wasn't just obsessed anymore. She was dangerous. The board moved fast. Another attorney's letter went out, this time warning Karen that her rallies violated noise ordinances, traffic safety rules, and HOA bylaws. If she continued, the HOA would not only pursue legal action, but also involve city authorities. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. Her rallies thinned. Her followers grew quieter. The endless flyers slowed to a trickle. It seemed, for a moment, that the fight was finally dying out. But then came the letter, delivered not by the HOA attorney, not by the state, but by Karen herself. Stuffed into every mailbox in the neighborhood, it was a handwritten manifesto, a rambling, furious tirade about corruption, betrayal, and conspiracies. In it, she swore she would never stop, that she would expose the truth if it was the last thing she did. Neighbors passed it around in disbelief. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. But I didn't laugh. Because when obsession reaches desperation, logic disappears. And Karen, stripped of her power and her audience, was teetering on the edge of desperation. The board convened a private emergency meeting. For hours, lights glowed from the community center windows as they debated the next step. Finally, a notice went out. Karen's membership privileges were suspended indefinitely. She was banned from attending meetings, barred from serving on committees, and stripped of her authority as a former board officer. It was the strongest punishment an HOA could issue without going to court. The neighborhood waited for her response. Would she lash out with another wave of rallies and flyers? Would she finally back down under the weight of public embarrassment? No one knew. But I had a sinking feeling we hadn't seen the last of her, because Karen was cornered now. And cornered. Karen was the most dangerous kind of all. The suspension notice hit the community like a thunderclap. For years, Karen had been the loudest voice in the neighborhood, the self-appointed watchdog, the self-proclaimed protector of property values. And now, in a single sheet of paper, she had been silenced. Or at least, that was the intention. The truth was, Karen was never going to take her punishment quietly. The first sign came 3 nights later. At 2 a.m., headlights cut across my bedroom wall. I peered out the window and saw her car creeping past my house, its engine rumbling low. She stopped at the curb, sat there for a moment, and then drove off. The next morning, I found another note. In my mailbox. This one wasn't a flyer or a manifesto. It was short, sharp, personal. You haven't won. You'll regret this. I didn't bother calling the HOA. I went straight to the police. They filed it as harassment, logged the note as evidence, and promised to keep an eye on things. But we all knew Karen was careful. She had learned, after the fines and the legal threats, to walk the line between menace and crime. Still, that line was wearing thin. The board, meanwhile, was done playing games. The president called a special meeting, this time not for the homeowners, but with city officials and the HOA's attorney. The message was clear. Enough is enough. Karen's rallies had violated permits. Her flyers had crossed into defamation. Her late-night door-knocking and harassment of neighbors had breached multiple ordinances. And now, with the note I had turned in, the city finally had enough to act. They moved forward with a restraining order. When the papers were served, Karen exploded. Neighbors reported hearing her screaming at the officer who delivered them, her voice echoing down the street like a siren. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. That night, her porch light stayed off for the first time in months. But Karen wasn't gone. The next week, she made one last desperate move. It was a Thursday evening, when the HOA held its monthly meeting. Attendance was higher than ever. People wanted to see if the drama was finally over. I went too, sitting quietly in the back row, scanning every face that entered. Karen wasn't supposed to be there. She was banned. But bans had never stopped her before. Halfway through the meeting, the doors burst open, and there she was, hair disheveled, papers clutched in both hands, eyes wild. "You can't silence me," she shouted, storming down the aisle. "This whole board is a sham. These fines, these lies, all of it. It's illegal, and I have proof." She slapped the papers onto the front table with such force they scattered across the floor. People gasped. Others groaned. The president calmly signaled for security, who had been stationed nearby for exactly this possibility. 2 officers approached, but Karen dug in her heels. "You're destroying this community," she screamed, jabbing a finger toward the board. "And you?" she whirled, pointing straight at me. "You started all of this. You're the reason everything is falling apart." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't flinch, because for the first time I didn't have to defend myself. The board president stood, lifted one of Karen's proof papers from the floor, and held it up. It wasn't a smoking gun. It wasn't evidence of corruption. It was the same rambling nonsense she had been peddling for months. Half-truths, twisted numbers, baseless accusations. "This," the president said firmly, "is why we can't allow this disruption any longer." The officers took Karen by the arms. She fought, of course, screaming, thrashing, threatening lawsuits and exposure. But it was over. They escorted her out of the room, her shouts echoing down the hallway, until the doors closed behind her, and then silence. For the first time in months, the community meeting continued without chaos. In the days that followed, the restraining order was enforced. Karen was prohibited from attending meetings, approaching board members, or contacting neighbors. She had harassed. Her rallies fizzled. Her flyers stopped. Her once loyal followers quietly distanced themselves, embarrassed by her final public meltdown. And slowly, life returned to normal. Lawns grew green again. Children played in the streets without being watched by suspicious eyes. The community center buzzed with conversations about block parties and holiday events instead of legal disputes and fines. As for me, I replanted my garden. This time it grew taller, brighter, and stronger than ever. Neighbors stopped to admire it, asking for clippings, trading tips, sharing laughter. What had once been the source of conflict became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground is worth the fight. Karen didn't disappear completely. Every so often, I'd see her car parked on the far edge of the neighborhood, her silhouette behind the wheel, watching. But she never came close. The restraining order kept her at bay, and the weight of her own choices kept her isolated. Her empire of control was gone, and for the rest of us, the community she tried to tear apart grew closer than ever, because nothing unites people quite Like surviving a storm together? And Karen? She was the storm, but storms always pass.